So welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone has had a nice break over lunch and maybe had a chance to get refreshed. So this morning we focused on the issue of security and resilience, and this afternoon we're going to be moving on to look at other key areas relating to 5G rollout. First of all, in a second, we're going to be looking at the issue of sustainability and how we can look to build a safer, more sustainable world with 5G. And then following that, we have our third panel of today, which starts at around about 3:15 CET, which is going to be looking specifically at the connectivity toolbox, so looking more at the rollout of 5G networks. One thing to mention before I introduce our moderator for this session, that for both the sessions this afternoon, we do have some audience polls running. I think the ones for this session are live already, so you need to click on the polls tab on the right-hand side of your screen, and that will enable you to vote in the polls that we have running. So both this session and the next session, we have separate polls running, so please do get involved and give us your thoughts on those. And of course, we do again welcome all of your questions and comments as you have been adding throughout the event so far. So please do add those again in the chat on the right-hand side, and those will be put to our panelists during the discussion part of the session. So as I said, our first session is going to be focusing on building a safer, more sustainable world with 5G. And to introduce the session, and of course to introduce our speakers, I'm delighted to now welcome to the stage Phil Laidler from STL Partners. So Phil, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan.
Session, and yeah, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. So this is going to be looking forward to this panel on building a safer, more sustainable world with 5G. Briefly want to introduce myself. I'm the consulting director at STL Partners, consulting and research firm, and we've been doing quite a lot of work recently, specifically looking into this question of sustainability in and around 5G. And in fact, we are running a webinar along these themes ourselves, which we invite you to join us on the 2nd of March. We've got a session in the morning and a session in the afternoon, so please do check that out, where we're sharing some research results. We've got panelists from Telefonica, from China Mobile, and from Vertiv, who are going to be sharing some of the insights from that exercise. But coming back to today, what I'd like to do is invite each of our panelists to give a brief presentation and set out a little bit what they've been doing and their key findings on this question. And then we're going to have a panel conversation. We are going to invite some questions from the audience, and I will ask you again to check out the poll on the right-hand side and do cast your vote on the two poll questions that we've set out. So let's move forward. First of all, I'd like to invite Alessandro Gropelli, who's a board member of the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative, the GESI initiative, and also at Aetna. And Alessandro, you're going to just run through some of the work that you've been doing there.
Thanks a lot, Phil, for the introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for tuning in. So I'll bring you today a perspective that is the one of GESI, the Global Sustainability Initiative, that gathers many actors in the ICT industry and that works on basically boosting or promoting the enabling potential of the ICT industry in greening all the other sectors of the economy. But I'll also speak to you with a second hat, which is my other job at ETNO, the European Telecoms Association, which represents the biggest European telecom operators. So I'll try to bring here an industry perspective on 5G and sustainability. Here in my first slide, I would like to show you just some numbers, facts, and figures so that we are on the same page before I move to a couple of general consideration. Well, here you can see how we look at 5G as an enabler of the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. Of course, as you know, no technology is a silver bullet to achieve these goals. But we think very much that 5G, around which this conference develops, can be a major enabler of at least some of the SDGs. So on the right-hand side of the slide, I show you some of those on which we believe that the telecom networks and services, and 5G in particular, can make a difference. Let me just do a couple of examples so that we are on the same page, and then I'll move on to some more facts and figures. The first one that you see up there is on good health and well-being. And in the past 1 year, we have witnessed how important it is to have telemedicine, because in a moment in which the accessibility of hospitals, for example, is kind of limited due to the COVID pandemic, we need alternatives. And through digital, we can today guarantee a certain level of accessibility. Here I have a very practical example. One of the most innovative telecom operators in Europe, Telia, is doing remote mammographies together with local authorities in Sweden through 5G. So basically they have a connected 5G van that gets to the last mile, gets closer to the patients to bring mammography also to areas that are remote. But then I could take another one that is maybe helping us to get closer to the carbon neutrality issue that we want to discuss today, and it's the affordable and clean energy one. There we believe that technologies like IoT, that will be, of course, boosted in a 5G scenario, can be very, very important when it comes to modernizing, basically, our energy grids. So this is in short to say that we believe that 5G infrastructure is not only a commercial opportunity in terms of getting better resolution for cat videos, but it is really a way to transform society and economy. This brings me to the next slide. Then from a European perspective, how are we doing? Because of course we need on the supply side and availability of 5G. Here you see how we are scoring on the blue lines in terms of basic, well, not basic, but current mobile broadband, which is basically 4G, on which you can actually already do a lot of stuff already. As you can see, Europe, USA, Japan, South Korea, we are doing well. We are getting very close to 100% of 4G connection. When it comes to 5G, the situation is a bit more nuanced. The orange bar shows you where we were with 5G at the end of last year. So the percentage of people covered by at least one 5G network in each geography. You see that Europe basically doubled from 12 to more than 24%. Between the year before and last year, but still, when we compare it to the United States, to Japan and South Korea, we're really lagging behind. This is a reason for concern. Let me show you the last slide to kind of tell you a bit the basics of my story. And this shows instead how European telcos are doing on basically two charts. On the left-hand side, the transition to renewable energy sources, and the right-hand side, how we're doing in terms of CO2 emissions per revenue. So in our view, the good news is that on the left side of the chart, you see that we continue to evolve in terms of use of renewables, while on the right-hand side of the chart, you see that we are reducing the CO2 emitted per each euro of revenue. This does not mean that the work is complete. It's far from complete, but it means that we are on a path to get there. Now, we can remove the slides and I can conclude with some consideration. The figures here showed you that in our view, there is a very interesting socioeconomic potential when it comes to transforming European economy and European industry towards a more sustainable scenario. What we also showed you is, however, that the path to get 5G wherever it is needed is still long. So basically, we need policies and regulation that are conducive to investment in 5G and to speeding up the rollout. Third thing that I wanted to leave you with is that we believe that the enabling potential of the ICT sector and of the telecom sector in specific makes it very special. So we're not discussing just about any sector, but we are discussing about a sector that can green substantively other sectors, just like transport, manufacturing, healthcare, so on and so forth. And there have been calculations on the side of an industry body, the GSMA, that say that basically we expect the enabling potential to be 10 times of the emissions of the telecoms industry. So I think that from the policy viewpoint, this could be a very interesting consideration when we look at whether we are pushing enough for a radical digitization as a tool to achieve our green objectives and, in European terms, the objectives of the Green Deal. Final point, and I conclude, the road towards 5G is still uphill. Just consider that only 2 countries on 27 in Europe have completed 5G auctions. And also consider that the vendors market is very particular in this phase, because we do not have as telecom operators the possibility to use all the vendors that are on the global markets. Then also consider that permits at the local levels sometimes create friction in terms of rollout of 5G. And finally, last year you might have seen that there was a spike of misinformation and disinformation on 5G. And just to name 2 very interesting findings of a research we did with Ipsos, in this opinion survey, 63% of the people didn't know, were not able to say whether 5G would harm bees or not. And 20% of the people were not sure whether 5G was responsible for COVID or not. So to summarize it, we think that the enabling potential is one of the big aspects that policymakers should focus on. At the same time, the greening of our networks is still a very important task, and it's not complete, and we will need investment to do that. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much for that, Paolo. Next up, I'd like to invite Pernilla, who is who's actually here as representing as a member of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, and is going to share a little bit of the work of that initiative. Over to you, Pernilla.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you from Europe for having us here from the Exponential Roadmap. I will talk about the importance of accelerating climate change towards 2030 and how critical mission this is for 5G. Next, please. So I always like to start this kind of presentations with a reality check. And what's sad is that every time I go to a new conference, I have to redo this slide, because there is always a new catastrophe or major climate event or some new insight from the research community. And today we will focus on climate mitigation. But what this tells us is also that when it comes to 5G, climate adaptation and how we can both adapt our own systems, but also help infrastructures will also be an important role for us. Next. So what is the Exponential Roadmap about? The Exponential Roadmap starts from a paper in Science, which translated complicated climate science into one simple rule of thumb, which is also aligned with the 1.5C report from the IPCC. And it shows that we need to halve emissions every 10 years until we reach a net zero condition. So the immediate challenge we have right now is to halve emissions this decade. Next, please. So what we see nowadays is that many companies are joining the race to zero and set up their own net zero targets. And that is, of course, excellent. And we would hope more companies to come on board there. But what we want to bring to the table from the Exponential Roadmap is that the net zero timeline are fully decided by the speed that we first need to halve our emissions, because everything is about the aggregated level of carbon in the air. So that means that if we fail to halve the global emissions by 2030, that means that we will have to be net zero much sooner. And seeing this first halving as a major challenge right now, and seeing that this is a decade of 5G, that means that we as you and we as an industry, as a community, need to make sure that 5G operates in a way that helps us with the climate. Next. So what we did in the Exponential Roadmap was to look at each sector of the society, so going from energy supply, industry, buildings, transport, food consumption, and agriculture, and even natural sinks, and to investigate the opportunities of halving emissions by 2030, and also which solutions to take us there. And I have no time to go into details here, so I just encourage you to read the roadmap if you haven't done that. But one thing which is in common for all of these is that scaling is key, and scaling exponentially. We do not have time to just make small incremental changes, and this is why 5G is important both as an accelerator and as an innovation platform for climate action. Next. But digitalization in general, and also 5G, of course, has a more versatile role. So one is, of course, our own footprint, and we know that the ICT's own emissions are roughly 1.4% of overall global emissions, which may not be very much compared to other sectors, but these are the footprint which is the responsibility of this industry. And we know that that also needs to halve emissions. And luckily, and I know that Paolo will come back on this topic, there is already halving trajectories defined and included in the Science Based Targets Initiative framework. But ICT is also a wild card of decarbonization, and even more so 5G. So ICT can enable 1/3 of the first halving of already with established technologies, and with 5G working in combination with AI, IoT, and others, we will have additional opportunities if we use them well. And of course, our technologies also influence the decisions of billions of producers and consumers every day. Next. But of course, when you have a common purpose technology, it's not automatically that it will bring you good things. It also depends on how you use it. You can use a hammer to build a house, but also to kill someone. So when we have those new interlinked technologies, they provide us with great opportunities, but also with risks. So if you take 5G in combination with others, they can increase the efficiency of different resources. They can help with circularity, knowledge building, behavioral changes, and system optimizations. But of course, if we use those technology to maintain or even increase high carbon industries and processes, they won't do us any good from the climate perspective. So this is a responsibility for the industry. Next. So to finish off, these are the 4 takeaways I want you to bring from this small introduction. So halving of global emissions by 2030, that is a prerequisite for our net zero plans, and something that we need to focus on right now. And then solutions exist to halve these global emissions in all sectors, but they must be scaled exponentially. And here 5G has a critical role to contribute to make this happen. And halving ICT's own footprint by 2030, that is possible, and it's also necessary, and it's the responsibility of the industry. And the 5G can also evolve within that, as we probably will hear more about in the discussion. And finally, 5G needs to become and be a decarbonization accelerator and a climate innovation platform, because this is the decade of 5G, but it's also the most critical decade for the climate. So we need to make sure that 5G supports this climate transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pernilla, for that. And a lot of those themes, I think, will resonate with the audience and the other speakers. So looking forward to following up on the discussion on those themes. Next up, I'd like to invite Victor Lopez, who's a representative from the Danish Energy Agency and on the Working Group for Climate Change. So Victor, please share with us your findings from that work.
Thank you, Phil. And first of all, I would like to, my colleague Robert, who was supposed to present this conference, sends his apologies. He had a pressing matter to attend to, so I'll be replacing him. So you can see his name on the slides. But I'm here as a member of the RSPG group on climate change. Denmark is one of the co-chairing administrations that I've been helping with the work. So I will tell a little bit of what are the focus and the findings of our work been so far. So next slide, please. Yes, so here in the slide, you can see the scope of our work as it was formulated in the terms of references. So we started this work about a year ago, and we've been focusing on these three aspects of or questions, as you can see on the slides. And the first one is identifying climate change related aspects within spectrum management. But also how spectrum management can help combating climate change, and if there's any concrete actions that should be recommended at EU level. And you have to keep in mind that this we're making a report, and in the near future an opinion which will recommend actions to the European Commission. So that's the main focus of our work. The working method that we've been following so far is having web meetings about once a month with the member states and members from the Commission, and lots of email correspondence. So we try to be as climate friendly as possible, as you can see. In order to not make the group sort of an echo chamber for member states, we decided to have input from stakeholders. So we organized a webinar in September last year. And we also did a public consultation last month, and we received a lot of replies and a lot of good information for our report. And the deliverables we should be delivering to the RSPG this year are the reports which we are working on, and an opinion in the autumn, which will hopefully recommend some concrete actions for the European Union. Next slide, please. So what are some of the aspects that we are covering in the report? So related to the first question, which was about climate change related aspects within spectrum management, well, we have the carbon footprint of the telecom sector itself, the wireless sector. So we're looking at possible ways to reduce this. But as our colleagues Alessandro and Pernilla alluded to and gave good explanations on in the presentations, there's also an enabling effect from the wireless sector, in that it can contribute to reducing the climate impact of other sectors, what we normally call verticals in our lingo. And perhaps less relevant for the topic of this conference is that we're also looking at the need to protect spectrum usages for climate monitoring, such as satellite services, for example. Then we have other aspects that involve for example, the legal basis of introducing climate protection measurements in spectrum management. So we are looking at what exists at a European level, and then what kind of possible administrative instruments we could establish within that paradigm. and also a discussion of possible issues associated with these measures, because they can also have an unexpected or negative impacts. Next slide, please. So what are some of the aspects that we are analyzing with respect to these regulatory measures? Well, first of all, I must say that it is a very, very complex issue, because to a large extent, we don't know what the impacts of such measures could be. But we're looking at what exists at a European level right now, and we have different initiatives that cover some of these aspects, such as the Ecosign Directive, which introduces requirements for the energy consumption of products. Then we have the Green Deal, for example, which is sort of an overarching European initiative to make the European Union climate neutral by 2050, while they take a look at different aspects, such as, well, the energy sector, buildings, reducing waste, industry, transport, and so on and so forth. So it's a large amount of work and a broad topic. Then we have the Circular Economy Action Plan, which is about making electronics and ICT equipment not only durable and efficient, but also repairable, upgradable, recyclable, reusable, and so on and so forth. But as you can see, a lot of these initiatives are about the equipment itself. So there's room for doing something about spectrum usage. So here we're taking a look at, for example, can we introduce any climate-related issues in spectrum auctions or licenses? Would that be a good idea? Well, if you ask the operators, they have a clear answer, a negative one, but it's still worth analyzing. We're also looking at whether there's a legal basis for that. Is it possible to do it? And an analysis of possible negative outcomes, for example, with respect to the market or competition. Then there's also standardization and harmonization aspects, which we can take a look at, and voluntary measures from the sector itself. Next slide, please. And then I would like to conclude with something about 5G, since it's the topic of this conference. We know that 5G is more energy efficient per data unit than previous generations. However, there's a concern that, at least to a certain extent, this benefit might be offset by not only the manufacturing and the deployments of the networks, but also by the large amounts of data used. But there can be a real benefit if the sector itself self-regulates by using more renewable energies, as I think Alessandro showed in his slides, or more energy efficient equipment. And then we also have the enabling effects, which I alluded to before, and which Alessandro made a good summary of, in that 5G can be used in other sectors to increase the efficiency, reduce energy consumption, emissions, and so on and so forth. So we're also taking a look at some of those aspects in some of those sectors. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Victor. And next up, I'd like to introduce Paolo Gemma, who's the chairman of the Working Party on Environment, Climate Change and Circular Economy at the ITU. So Paolo, if you could just share the work that's been taking place at the ITU on this climate change and circular economy.
Okay, hi. I am Paolo Gemma. I am the chairman of the Working Party 2 on ITU-T, and we share with you what we are making in ITU-T regarding 5G development. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, this is what we are making. We are providing international standard for the implementation of 5G, thinking to help operator to give them some practical solutions and technical guidance on how to roll out a 5G in a faster way, in a sustainable manner. We provide a metric and methodology to assist the energy efficiency of 5G and all the network. our goal is also to provide policymakers for the framework for guiding them to implement relative and efficiency policy and make some foundation to make an informed decision for working in harmony with the 5G operator. And last but not least, citizens. We work also in some document for the information on how to assist the 5G to give information to the citizens on which is the impact of 5G technology. If you can go to the next, what we do practically, we develop international standard, we make some research and pre-standardization work, we try to have awareness raising to the people and active collaboration with a lot of organizations. So we are not working by ourselves, but we collaborate with other standard organizations, with forum, industry association, and so on. Can you go to the next? When we speak about 5G, we are working on 4 different aspects. One is the EMF, so which is the impact of 5G technology on the compliance from this human protection point of view. That is a very big issue because it's a completely new frequency, new technology, and we need to explain clearly to the people what will be the impact and also define how to make the compliance to the existing limit on this. We are looking on the resistibility this is more from operator, how to have equipment to resist to the environment and to the disturbance generated by the 5G equipment or by other equipment. And the last, okay, the energy feeding and efficiency. We define method and metric for measure the energy efficiency in 5G. Look in detail, if you can go to the next slide, on what we are making. This is just a list of the different documents that we provide on the different aspects, on electromagnetic compatibility, on electromagnetic field, on energy feeding efficiency as smart solution, where we make a lot of documents on this and on resistibility. Going on detail on what we are making, if you can go to the next slide, we publish a standard that is the L1210 on sustainable power feeding solution for 5G. So is some ideas and requirements on how to build a radio site more sustainable respect to the traditional site, with a new idea on efficiency to use the solar site, and so on, to help a very sustainable development of 5G. Consider that in 5G will be an incredible amount of sites, so it's not possible to use traditional solution differently. The impact from environmental point of view will be terrible. The other is the L1331, that is a standard that proposes metrics and method on how to measure this metric to see which is the efficiency of a network, so of a 5G network. This standard was started from GSM, then go to 4G, and now include also the requirement for the 5G to see which is the efficiency of a global network, not at an equipment level, but a global level. Going on, which is the next step. If you go to the next standard, is just looking and connected to what Pernilla said before. Okay, we need to have a more sustainable world, and this is the L1470. Is a standard that we publish in collaboration with GSA, with SBTA, with GSMA, to define which are the trajectory that Pernilla showed in one of the last slides, define which is the trajectory for the ICT sector to respect the Paris Agreement. So we have defined for ICT sector, for open network, for network, for data center, we should be the reduction of CO2. What the sector need to do to respect the Paris Agreement, and was defined as some number, thinking on estimate CO2 emission of a sector in 1 year. Then we define for 2030, for 2050, which should be the reduction that the industry need to do. Helping to that, we define also some other guidance document, one for the operator of network and data center owner, and the other for industry on what they need to reduce. So which are the reduction that our operator need to do, which are the reduction that our manufacturer need to do to have, we hope, a more sustainable world in future. If you go to the next, okay, this is what we are making. We are dividing questions. Okay, we are not making only energy efficiency and an adaptation to climate change mitigation, and so on. But we are working also a lot on e-waste and circular economy. And also on this is helping to have a more sustainable 5G development, because apply the principle of circular economy to 5G is also important to reduce the impact of the future 5G network. And this is all from my side.
Thank you very much for that, Paolo. That's actually really interesting. And I know there was lots of numbers and 1210 and 1331, but I think these standards and these metrics on reporting and these principles are the nitty-gritty of what it's going to take to meet some of the objectives. And the circular economy in particular, we often overlook that for most consumers, 80% of carbon is actually embedded in the device, and you have to look beyond scope 2 and the MGU, so you have to look at embedded. So my last speaker we're going to invite is Jan Besa, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Sustainable Development, Environmental Science and Engineering at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And I think you're going to share with us some research you've undertaken, I think in Switzerland, if I recall correctly, on again these themes of enablement as well as 5G network efficiencies.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for the nice introduction. To briefly introduce myself, my name is Jan Besa and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at KTH in Stockholm. And today I want to present the results of a study we conducted on the climate impacts of 5G mobile networks in Switzerland in the year 2030. Which we conducted together with the organizations you see on top of this slide. And if you can go to the next slide, please. We actually looked at two key questions here. We were on the one side wondering how much greenhouse gas emissions will be caused by the 5G networks itself, by the production of all the 5G infrastructure which needs to be rolled out in Switzerland in the future, and by the operation of this infrastructure in Switzerland in the year 2030. So that's what we consider the greenhouse gas footprint of the 5G networks. And then we also thought about the enabling fact of 5G infrastructure. So 5G networks will support many diverse use cases across industries. And we were wondering, well, are there use cases which are supported by 5G, which have the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Switzerland? And how much can they actually reduce? So I would like to start with the first research question. If you go to the next slide, please. Here you can see that we start with the first one. And if we go on then, so what we found, let me explain you the graph you see on the left here briefly. You see here the amount of CO2 equivalents caused per gigabyte of data transfer via mobile networks. On the left side today with 2G to 4G networks, on the right side in 2030 with 4G and 5G networks. And it's not either 4G or 5G, it's a world where both exist, because still in 2030, 4G networks will exist and some data will still be transferred via them. And what we can see here, what is the main conclusion, is that data transfer via 5G networks will cause less greenhouse gas emissions per gigabyte. That means, in the end, that if we want to meet our expected increase in data transfer via mobile networks, with 5G networks, it's the most, let's say, greenhouse gas emission efficient way we can do it. If we would try to meet this increase in data demand with 4G networks, we would create more greenhouse gas emissions in the future. However, we have an efficiency increase here. But the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions by mobile networks between 20 and 2030 will remain roughly stable, because on the one side, we get more efficient per gigabyte, but on the other side, we send more gigabytes. And what we also found is that if we compare the footprint of mobile networks in general compared to the footprint of the whole ICT sector, thinking about all the end user devices we have, the computers, the smartphones, and so on, also the data centers and so on, the mobile networks and specifically the 5G networks will only cause a small share of the total greenhouse gas footprint of the ICT sector, actually less than 3% in Switzerland. So we have to think about decarbonizing the whole ICT sector and not just 5G networks. Can we please go to the next slide? So now we quickly look at the second research question. So which use cases can benefit from 5G mobile networks and what is their potential to avoid greenhouse gas emissions? And if we go to the next slide, we see on the left side that 5G networks provide different forms or sorts of capabilities. For example, sending high amounts of data volumes at high data rates. The possibility to connect many devices, including IoT devices at the same time. Very low latency, being able to send data while being on the move, also at higher speeds, high reliability and variability. And all these capabilities together provide benefits for various use cases. On the right side, you see various use cases across industries which are supposed to benefit from these capabilities. And the central advantage of 5G networks is actually that all these capabilities, which you see on the left side, are met with one mobile network technology. If we look at the example of automated driving, maybe automated driving could be also enabled with Wi-Fi or with a combination of different mobile network technologies. There's an advantage of realizing it with 5G because 5G combines an ultra-low latency with a high mobility, with a high reliability, and with a high availability. And only by combining all these capabilities in one technology is what makes it possible to enable use cases like automated driving. Out of all of these use cases, we selected 4 use cases, which we see on the next slide, and estimated their potential to avoid greenhouse gas emissions in Switzerland in 2030. So you see the blue bars here show the potential of these use cases here to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. And broadly speaking, the potential to avoid greenhouse gas emissions by 5G supported use cases is significantly higher than the amount of greenhouse gas emissions caused by the 5G networks themselves. However, what we have to consider is that these use cases and these greenhouse gas reduction potentials are not silver bullets. It's not like that by putting 5G out there, we automatically enable these reduction potentials. We need to combine it with targeted actions to make this low carbon future become reality. To illustrate this at one example, the example of automated driving, which is clearly a use case which is supported by 5G networks. Automated driving can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future if we use it to support shared mobility. However, automated driving can also lead to a significant increase of transport if we use it to promote individual mobility. Nobody might want to take a train or public transport in future if we all have our private cars, automated driving cars who can bring us from A to B in a very convenient way. So these use cases are not silver bullets, but they need to combine with targeted actions to realize these reduction potentials. So to conclude on my last slide, I want to summarize the main conclusions we have. Well, meeting the expected increase in data demand with 5G networks will cause less greenhouse gas emissions than meeting with the 4G networks. In order to keep the greenhouse gas footprint of 5G networks low, operators should think about ways to roll out as few infrastructure as possible, should think about, well, once we have 5G networks, can we decommission older network infrastructures, for example, 2, 3G networks, and they should operate it with renewable energies. Regarding the enabling effect, there are certainly high potentials for 5G supported use cases to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. However, just by putting 5G out there, those potentials are not realized, but they need to be combined with the right measures in order to realize these reduction potentials. And thank you very much for listening.
And thank you very much for that. And really great set of presentations there. 5 sets of perspectives, very complementary. you get a sense from the 5 panelists today that we could fill a whole 2-day conference just with the material we've covered here. And I'm sure we could, because there's a lot of topics. We've got half an hour left, and we want to see what we can do with our half an hour. First up, I'd like us to try and get the results of the poll, if possible, Dan. Can we see what our audience has said on the 2 polls?
Those have been posted, Phil, in the private chat, so you'll see those in there. So, okay.
Oh, sorry. Great. Okay, so I'm going to read out. Yep, indeed. They're down here. We've got. Here we go. Oh, there's loads of questions here. So we asked the question up front. First poll was, what is the impact overall on overall mobile networks, the net impact of 5G? So if you look at the overall carbon emissions and energy, 2 different things, from 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G across European networks between 2021 and 2026, so it's relatively short term, what do you think the impact will be? 16% of people felt that it would result in a big net increase in both energy and in carbon emissions. 21% of people felt that it would lead to a smaller net increase in energy and carbon emissions. And then 21% also felt that it would lead to a net increase in energy, but a net decrease in carbon emissions due to the use of more renewables within the mix. So that's 21% who felt that, yeah, energy might still go up, but emissions would come down. And there's 41% who felt that there would be a net decrease in energy and carbon emissions. And only 1% thought there would be a significant net decrease in energy and net zero carbon emissions. So whoever you are out there, you're fiercely optimistic. Well, well done for voting there. But then the breakdown there again is 16%, 21%, 21%, 41%, and the 1% rather optimistic person who think we get to net zero carbon emissions from all of our mobile networks across Europe. But that was an interesting set. So rather than go straight on to the next poll, I'd like the audience to, A, first up, tell us where you believe, and B, just comment on the vote. So could I start with you, Alessandro? Where do you believe where do you believe?
I assume that our audience is more enthusiastic about 5G than the general population, or more informed. So in a way, I'm not very surprised that so many are optimistic about 5G adoption and its potential. What I want to say is that for the work we did in JAISY, it is clear that the transition over time, of course, over time, needs to be complete. So there remains an issue of legacy networks. And that's something that I know very well from my job at Ethno. It's more difficult to build something from scratch than to upgrade what you have or change what you had before. Because we still have a lot of copper networks out there when it comes to fixed, and we still have previous generations. So now we really need to create the conditions to shift in the coming years to the new generations, both in terms of fiber and in terms of 5G, so that over time, at the right time, we can switch off the old generations. And here I just make you an example. I was speaking to some colleagues in Ethno today who are still fighting on the front of equals, where there are some industry sectors in Europe that want to keep on older mobile generations like 2G for a long time. So the transition to the new generations needs to be incentivized. And that's why I think that the European approach to the EU Green Deal is very good, because it is an industrial policy approach. It's not only about our sector, it's also about the others. We need the economy to make the transition all together so that we can shift to what is smarter and to what is better and to what is more energy efficient from this viewpoint.
Okay, thank you for that. For the others, just in the interest of time, if you could just tell me where you would vote. Just to summarize from your point of view, just so we can get on to the next poll. So very quickly, Pernilla, where would you cast your vote in terms of if all things remain the same? Let's be slightly pessimistic and say if before the accelerator is successful, what is the trajectory? Where would you put your vote?
Yeah, maybe in this case, as we are talking about Europe, I could go with the majority, even though in global conditions, I would think energy would increase slightly.
So you're optimistic then that there's a net decrease in energy as well as a bigger decrease in carbon emissions. You're optimistic.
I challenge the industry in Europe to do that.
In
yes.
Europe, great, thank you for that. And Victor, do you have an opinion on where you think it's heading in Europe?
Well, not really. I'm sorry if I'm going to give a slightly longer answer, but the real answer is we don't know, because we have the legacy issue, as Alessandro pointed, but there's also a matter of consumer behavior. What happens if there's some kind of killer application comes in the market, sort of like the smartphone when it did, and increases data consumption a lot.
This is sometimes referred to as the Jevons paradox, which is that if you make something so much better and so much cheaper, you get step changes in usage. Or people start watching high definition cat videos without realizing. So they quadruple their consumption of data for a very minor improvement in experience. So I think that is a genuinely, it's a genuine risk. In a sense, 5G is supposed to stimulate all this demand, but how much could that be? And even if you're more efficient, there's a race of that. So it's a fair point. We don't know that relationship. In the interest of time, Paolo, very quickly, where would you have put your vote?
If I look in Europe, I can agree with Pernilla that will be a reduction on both. If we look on worldwide, to arrive to have a reduction in carbon emission and energy, we need a long time, because they need to switch off all the existing net, and this is very problematic.
And in some places, they're very dependent on high carbon power.
Yes.
It's even
not only a carbon power, is to convince people to change all the phone, because if they have a 2G phone, they need to buy a new phone.
That's true, and
they don't have money, maybe.
Then there's some embedded carbon in there too. Finally, Jan, you've done some work looking at this in Switzerland. If you would extrapolate your findings, where would you have come out on these 5 votes?
Well, if I would think about our findings regarding that question, I would think if we accept that we want to send more and more data over mobile networks, I think the most efficient way we can do this will be with 5G networks, definitely in the future. It's going to be more efficient than doing this with older network technology.
Okay, but is it net? What's the net? I'm putting you on the spot. What's the net? Do you think it's going to come down? Do you think it's going to go up slightly, or energy come down? Or because I think what you were saying is that if I recall from your presentation, the energy use would maybe go up slightly, but the emissions would come down, which would put you, that would put you somewhere in the middle here.
I would basically say we might have a slight increase in greenhouse gas emissions caused by mobile networks, but this increase would be bigger if we would try to do everything with just 4G networks.
Okay, great. So you might side slightly more skeptically based on what you've seen. So thanks for that. I'm going to move on to the next question. I'm just going to read out the results to the panel, and then I'm going to more broadly ask you to, you've got a magic wand and you've got a realistic policy on spectrum, realistic spectrum policy. Where would you focus? But let me just read you out the results. The question for the second poll was, which of the following most practical mechanism for spectrum regulators? So we're going back to spectrum, 5G spectrum regulation. So what are the most practical mechanism to make 5G networks more sustainable? The first option was require reporting, standard reporting. In other words, kilowatt per hour per terabit data, or kilogram of CO2 per terabyte. Make it obligatory for all the operators to report. And they should do that both on an aggregate scale, but on a customer level too, so that customers know what their carbon footprint from using the services. 21% of people said, it's about reporting. Let's get a visibility out there, let the market drive decisions, but let's force operators to be visible. The second one was network sharing, mandate or facilitate greater network sharing, that automatically is going to deliver a huge saving if you have more network sharing. Not very popular with some of the vendors, but certainly in terms of carbon emissions, that's a route. 25% of people felt that that was a clear route for policy to drive greater network sharing and therefore avoid duplication of resources. The third option here was require the decommissioning of 2G, 3G and 4G networks. 13% of people felt that requiring decommissioning. We've seen decommissioning in the US. It can be done even not mandated by governments, but it can be done through collaboration between operators so that one operator retains a 2G network and all the other operators close theirs down and hand their customers over. That's been done. The next one is require standards. So again, this comes back to the work being done by Paolo and the ITU. Require greater standards, minimum component efficiency performance design standards at the data center level. So that 17% of people agreed with that. And then finally, a little more draconian here, impose carbon tax or penalties if you don't achieve certain levels. So you set a line in the sand, say these networks have to produce no less than 10 joules per megabit delivered, which by the way is really low. And if you don't get there by this date, then we're going to penalize you. We're going to introduce some penalties. 17% of people were up for that. And then 8% of people said other. So I'm not going to ask you which of this, but I'm going to put the question to you, all of you. Look, you're suddenly in a position to mandate policy on spectrum. What is the one thing that you think spectrum regulators could do that would have the biggest impact on 5G? So Pernilla, if I can start with you, you've been given this power. What would you do with it?
Yeah, and I would probably go with Jan as also having a research background and complicate things a bit. So first, I think this is about systems rather than components. So I think it's important to have a system level. Then I think there are like two tools that we may use. It's both penalties and incentives, and usually in Europe you use the penalties to get rid of what's in the bottom, and then you use the incentives to advance progress. So I would combine that, and then I think reporting as such is not enough, but you have to combine that with a target or a threshold of some kind.
Okay, so you would kind of group some of these together and say you've got to work across the piece. It's not one thing you do. You've got to do things across that. So can I ask, I don't know, Jan, what would you do based on what you've seen? You're suddenly in charge of the spectrum regulation in a country in Europe. What would you if you had to pick one? I know you're probably going to do the same as Pernilla, so you need to do all of them, but I'm going to force you to choose the one that you think is the most critical, and then you can argue why it has to be done with the others.
Okay, if I'm forced to make it simple, I will go for network sharing, because a lot of the climate impacts are caused by producing all this equipment, and the less resources or infrastructure we roll out, the less climate impact we will cause.
Okay, and that's a majority. In fact, I think there was 25% on that, so there's consensus there. And then I could just ask the others very briefly to add to that. Paolo, what would you say?
As I think that sure, impose a minimum component efficiency is the minimum that I can do, and some of them are in reality are not related to 5G, like the sharing or the decommission is this is more at the network level. I like the first request standardized energy emission reporting, also if it's not so easy to do in reality. It's very complicated. I think it's the minimum to make a decision.
Great for consultants. I'm really up for that one, but obviously I have an agenda. But thank you, Paolo. And then Victor, do you feel willing or able to judge, cast your views on what spectrum regulation should do to drive sustainability in 5G?
I think our colleagues have very, very good points about the incentives and penalties and network sharing working. I think we would also benefit from gathering data, so reporting could be very important to make decisions from the regulator side. So that could also be very beneficial, I think, for our own interest.
Great. So thank you for that. I'm conscious that we've got some questions starting to come in. So I'm just going to ask one or two quick questions from you before we turn to the audience questions. Two questions. I want you to answer these very quickly in succession. So first question is, should we focus on energy and emissions? And I know you're going to say both, but in what order? So is it about energy or efficient? Is it about energy or about emissions? Quickly, each in turn. So Jan, can I start with you? Energy or emissions?
First emissions, then energy, because if you think about emissions, you think about ways to reduce energy consumption and think about using renewable energy.
Okay, so you're saying emissions first. And Paolo, what are you saying?
In reality, on contrary, before reduce of energy, because if we reduce energy, we can really move to renewable usage in the night.
Great. And Victor, do you have a view? Energy or emissions? What comes first?
I would say emissions, because not all energy is created equal, but it's easier to monitor energy consumption on the other hand.
Okay. Pernilla, do you have a view?
Yeah, sorry, I have to say both, because we need to cut down on emissions, and energy efficiency is an important lever.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Fine. And Alessandro, do you have a view?
I would also say a mix of both, and then later at the right time, I want to add a thing on network sharing, but can be done later.
Okay, we will get a chance. We still have another quarter of an hour to go, even though we've got a lot of questions coming. But thanks for responding to that question, which I think I asked it deliberately because I know that it is both, and you have to think about both, and we have to be a bit careful on that. The last question I want to touch is slightly controversial. But I would like to raise with you, which is, and we are guilty of this at STL because we have produced lots of reports, which is that is the argument around enabling, is it really a legitimate argument, or is it a bit of an excuse that industry uses to avoid taking action on its own energy and emissions? So it's slightly controversial. It's like, look, this enabler argument, is it really legitimate, or are our operators risk hiding from adopting best practice themselves by, and you've all alluded to it, Jan. You said, well, the problem with using the enabling argument is, what if you enable bad practice? Do you have to include that in the formula? In which case, are you just selecting the good cases? I'm just going to throw that back to you all. Is this a legitimate argument? Is the enabling argument truly legitimate? Can I start with you, Pernilla, because you're very focused on the exponential roadmap. So, sorry, the roadmap. So, is that a legitimate argument in your eyes?
I would again say both, because I mean the larger impact, whether it be positive or negative, if you use the system for the wrong thing, are within the what you call enablement or the induced effects, really. But then the footprint, you will have no credibility at all if you are not working on your own footprint at the same time. So both.
I think that's a good point. Alessandro, what would you add to that?
If I may, both in JASI terms and in ETNO terms, every time that we start typing a document on these topics, we always consider both greening by and greening both. Both tracks are extremely important, not only for a matter of credibility, but because they do go together. That's my first consideration. My second consideration, from a policy viewpoint, if you don't look at uptake of digital technologies and a digital transformation as a tool to get to the Green Deal, you are missing out on a huge opportunity. Now, one of the problems that I observe here in Brussels is that we still struggle to measure the enabling potential in a way in which we all agree how to measure this thing. So we need to do more efforts on agreeing on standards to measure this enabling potential and understand it, but we cannot leave it there. I mean, it's just too good and too important to be left aside in a moment in which you can kill two pigeons with one stone. You can accelerate the carbon neutrality and strengthen your economy and future-proof it, because that's what we're talking about, right? So that's my short one.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to some of the questions from the audience because we don't have much time to go. There's an interesting question here from Nicole, who's asked us, do we know if there's any country or authority that's included specific terms on sustainability around spectrum regulation? Do we have any examples that we're aware of a country? Just asking the panelists, do you know anywhere that's done anything specifically on that in their conditions for spectrum? Okay, well, that's pretty damning indictment, isn't it? Oh, yes, Pernilla, you do.
I have seen an example some years back. I think it was in Italy where there were an incentive in reduced fee if you had kept within a certain carbon emission level, if I recall well.
Well, we have a couple of Italians on the panel, so do they want to contribute to that?
Was true this, but it's
long time.
If Alessandro agree, generate a lot of discussion because it was not as was not standard at that time to how to calculate. I think that we spend 1 or 2 years to decide if the operator respect the rule or not is something very complicated.
Okay.
And maybe as the second Italian, I can also say that Italy, by our measurements, is where telcos pay the spectrum the most for 5G. And this maybe brings me just to the point that there are competing regulatory and policy objectives on this. So in a way, if I were a policymaker looking after the Green Deal, probably I'm going to compete with other regulators in my government who have other objectives, including public budget and public finances. But if you look at it from the 5G viewpoint, well, that's the same process, right? So if the regulators are going to ask too many things, they are probably not gonna get everything. So some choices will need to be made there.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to touch, just in the last few minutes, I'm going to touch on some more of the questions we've got on here. I mean, there's a specific question here from Ewan, who's asked if we've got any idea what the CO2 equivalent emissions for 1 gigabyte of 4G data or €1 of spending on mobile. So do we have any benchmarks we're aware of for 4G and 5G data and some CO2? Are there any kind of key numbers? I threw one up on the poll, but do you have any specific views? Yeah, Pernilla?
I don't have a specific figure for 4G, but I saw this question, so I looked it up. So I know that in around 2015, there was a 0.8 kilogram CO2 per gigabyte of data, but that was like an ICT average. So, but then of course the footprint has not increased very much, and the gigabytes have increased very much. So it should at least be lower.
Okay, so that's interesting. There's a data point there. And I noticed quite a few questions. I think they're all from Dean Bubley, so I know Dean rather too well. So on these, I'm going to let you have one question, Dean, but not all of them. I guess the question Dean's making here on question 2 is the enablement of this 10 times saving that we've all referenced. Yeah, this is really coming from the network, and the question he is asking is how much of the savings attributable to 5G rather than the devices themselves, such as video conferencing, webcam, screens. So Dean's question is, look, when we talk about this, are we only looking at our networks? Are we not considering the energy use of the appliances and the embedded energy in those appliances related to that use? I guess that's a question to you, Jan, and maybe to some of the others. Are we very much focused and obsessed with the networks rather than the overall use, including the devices?
Yeah, actually what we asked ourselves the same question in our study, and we actually included in the calculations the networks, but also the end user devices and so on required. And we came to the conclusion that the networks impact is way smaller than the impact of other devices. And if you think about the whole ICT sector, mobile networks is a small part. So we have to look at the ICT sector as a whole there.
Yeah, okay. So it probably doesn't include it. And if we did include it, it might lead to some different results.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just normally what is said about the software application is normally is part of an enabling effort in reality. is not the CO2 emission from net or for 5G. Then Pernille, I think, have more data on this because she worked more on this, but I think it's depending on the study. Some time include the terminal, some time no. It's depending on what you are looking in reality.
No, I just wanted to refer to the ITU standards. So there is a life cycle assessment standard for comparative analysis, L1410, which Paolo didn't mention. And that one states that you should have a full life cycle perspective, which means that if you look at the solution, you should consider both devices and network and so on. And when you look at the advantages it brings. So it's there is a standard to on how to do this right.
Thank you. There's another question which I strongly suspect is from Dean Bubley, but I will ask it nonetheless. He's extending the question regarding network sharing to neutral hosts and to sort of other forms of shared networks. And I guess the question is, on spectrum management, should there be more rules around optimizing or encouraging or optimizing or facilitating the adoption of neutral hosts and other innovative arrangements, particularly for, I guess, for in-building coverage, for other dense and potentially for rural. So I guess the question here, it's an extension of the spectrum sharing, but it's about allowing innovation for forms of wholesale neutral provision of networking. Is that, overall, I noticed that 25% of the audience agreed on the network sharing. I guess for me this is another form of network sharing. Do we feel that is something that needs to be mandated or made much easier within the spectrum rules? Anyone's got a view on this?
I think this is a good question, okay, because it's not easy to answer. If I look from EMF point of view, maybe yes, because we reduce the number of transmitter. From network point of view, is depending a lot what mean, because if at the end the traffic is the same. So and then from this point of view, there is no reduction. If we look on material, yes, will be less material, so the global impact maybe it will be less. If I go back as Italian, if I look from a regulator point of view, if I sell only one license, they take only one bill. So I don't know if a regulator agree too much on this. It should be nice to have an idea more about this.
Okay. No, I think we're kind of running out of time. So I think it's been a great conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. We've also explored just how rich and complex this is and how there isn't going to be a silver bullet. They're going to have to be a lot of actions, both at a regulatory level, but also at an industry level. And we're going to need to start taking this much more seriously, so it's front of mind. But I think to Pernille's point, look, this is the decade of 5G, and it's also the decade of the big transition to lower carbon economies. Those two have got to be coupled, and operators need to seize those as an opportunity. They need to seize that as an opportunity. It's a challenge, by all means, but it's also an opportunity. So a lot of work to be done here, and I think regulation on spectrum has a part to play. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists for your contribution, for your presentations, for the conversation. I'd obviously like to thank the audience for their participation on the polling and on the questions, and hand back over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Phil, and I'd also like to thank you for expertly moderating that session. So thanks to you, and echo your thanks to the panelists as well. So really interesting conversation, and one that we could have continued for a lot longer, I'm sure, and and one that I'm sure is going to be continued in future events and things going forward. So thank you all very much, and an excellent panel once again. Thank you. So next up we have a short break. So we have around about 30 minutes or so for you all to go and grab a coffee and maybe kind of stretch your legs a little bit. And then we're back here again on the main stage, as I said, in 30 minutes time. So at 3:15 CET, with our final session of the day, which is going to be moving on to look at connectivity. So looking at the connectivity toolbox and looking at how the cost of deploying 5G networks can be reduced, and the work that's being done to hopefully work towards that. So that's going to be here in 30 minutes. So please do make sure you're back in time for that. But for now, once again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Phil, and thank you to all of you out there for your questions as well. And we'll see you back here in 30 minutes. Thanks.